What you will learn in this story. Why stolen digital master keys let attackers impersonate anyone in an organization. How fragmented identity systems create hidden security gaps that hackers exploit. Why unified identity and access management (IAM) acts like a single secure key ring. The 4 A's of identity security: administration, authentication, authorization, and audit, and how they work together. The role of privileged accounts and why they need extra protection. How federation bridges connect identity systems across companies without exposing secrets. Why monitoring user behavior is key to spotting imposters in real time. How combining IAM with zero trust creates a digital fortress against breaches. Practical strategies organizations use to manage identity risk at scale. Why mastering identity security is a cornerstone skill for future cybersecurity architects. Chapter 4: The Master Key System. The emergency meeting was called for 6 a.m. on a Monday morning, which meant something had gone catastrophically wrong over the weekend. Dr. Elena Vasquez, Chief Identity Officer for a Fortune 100 multinational corporation, arrived at the Security Operations Center to find her team of identity and access management specialists huddled around multiple screens displaying what looked like a digital crime scene. "Talk to me," Elena said, setting down her coffee and pulling up a chair to the main console. "We've got a sophisticated identity compromise that started Friday evening," replied James Park, her lead IAM architect. "Someone gained administrative access to our primary Active Directory domain and has been systematically escalating privileges across multiple business units. They're not stealing data, they're positioning themselves for something much bigger." Elena studied the access log scrolling across the screen. After 15 years of building and securing enterprise identity systems, she could read these patterns like a detective reading evidence at a crime scene. The attack demonstrated intimate knowledge of their identity architecture, privilege escalation pathways, and business processes. This wasn't a random cyber criminal. This was someone who understood exactly how their digital fortress was designed and where its weak points lay hidden. "Show me the attack timeline," Elena requested, knowing that understanding the sequence of identity compromises would reveal both the attacker's methodology and the architectural weaknesses that enabled their success. What unfolded over the next hour will become a masterclass in why identity and access management represents the most critical foundation layer of any cybersecurity architecture. Every other security control, from endpoint protection to network monitoring to data encryption, depends entirely on the ability to accurately determine who is requesting access, what they are authorized to do, and whether their behavior matches expected patterns. The attack had succeeded because the organization's identity infrastructure violated fundamental principles that Elena had spent her career advocating for and implementing. Today would become a painful but valuable lesson in why identity management cannot be treated as just another IT service, but must be architected as the foundational security capability that enables everything else. The foundation crisis: when directory services become attack vectors. As Elena and her team reconstructed the attack sequence, a troubling pattern emerged. The organization had grown through multiple acquisitions over the past decade, each bringing its own identity management systems, directory services, and user databases. Rather than consolidating these systems into a unified identity architecture, the IT organization had implemented what Elena privately called the spaghetti approach, connecting disparate systems through custom integrations that created a complex web of identity relationships that no single person fully understood. The primary corporate directory ran on Microsoft Active Directory, containing approximately 45,000 employee accounts across 23 countries. But this central directory was only part of the story. The organization also maintained separate LDAP directories for specific business units, application-specific user databases for legacy systems that couldn't integrate with Active Directory, and cloud-based identity providers for software-as-a-service applications that had been implemented by individual departments without central oversight. "James, walk me through how user identities flow between these systems," Elena requested, knowing that the attack had exploited gaps in this complex synchronization architecture. James brought up a network diagram that looked like a spider web of interconnected systems. "We've got 16 different identity stores with 47 synchronization relationships. Some use real-time LDAP replication, others use scheduled batch updates, and a few rely on manual CSV file imports that happen quarterly during compliance reviews." Elena felt a familiar mixture of frustration and professional challenge. This architecture represented everything wrong with treating identity management as a tactical IT problem rather than a strategic security foundation. Each additional identity store created new attack surfaces. Each synchronization relationship created potential points of failure. Each manual process created opportunities for human error that attackers could exploit. The fundamental problem was that the organization had implemented what identity professionals call silo directories, separate identity stores that serve specific applications or business functions without comprehensive integration or central governance. This approach seemed efficient from a project management perspective because it allowed individual business units to implement solutions quickly without waiting for enterprise-wide architectural decisions. However, it created precisely the type of complex, interconnected environment that sophisticated attackers could exploit. "Show me the privilege escalation path," Elena said, suspecting she already knew what they would find. The attack had begun with a successful phishing campaign that compromised a single user account in the marketing department. This account had standard user privileges in the primary Active Directory domain, but it also had administrative rights in a legacy LDAP directory that supported the marketing automation platform. The attackers had discovered that this legacy directory contained service accounts with elevated privileges in the primary domain, a configuration that had been implemented years earlier to enable single sign-on functionality, but had never been properly reviewed or secured. By compromising the marketing user account, the attackers gained administrative access to the legacy directory. From there, they extracted credentials for service accounts that had domain administrator privileges in the primary Active Directory environment. Within 6 hours of the initial compromise, they had effective control over the organization's entire identity infrastructure. Elena recognized this attack pattern from industry incident reports and academic research. Attackers had learned that modern organizations' most significant identity vulnerabilities rarely existed in the primary directory services themselves, which were typically well-secured and monitored. Instead, vulnerabilities existed in the complex integration relationships between directory services, in legacy systems that couldn't be easily updated, and in service accounts that had been granted excessive privileges to enable interoperability. The attack demonstrated why identity architecture must be treated as a unified system rather than a collection of independent services. Each directory, database, and synchronization relationship represented a potential attack vector that could compromise the entire identity infrastructure if not properly designed, secured, and monitored. The 4 pillars of identity architecture. Elena called an emergency meeting with her extended team, including representatives from IT operations, application development, business process owners, and executive leadership. The room was tense. Everyone understood that the identity compromise represented a fundamental failure in the organization's security foundation that could impact every aspect of business operations. "We need to understand why our identity architecture failed and how we're going to prevent this from happening again," Elena began. "But before we dive into technical remediation, I want everyone to understand the 4 foundational requirements that any enterprise identity system must satisfy. I call them the 4 A's: administration, authentication, authorization, and audit." She moved to the whiteboard and drew 4 interconnected circles. These aren't separate functions, they're interdependent capabilities that must work together to provide comprehensive identity governance and security. Administration encompasses the entire lifecycle of identity management, from initial account creation through ongoing maintenance to final account deactivation. This includes provisioning new users when they join the organization, updating their access rights when their roles change, and ensuring that their accounts are properly disabled when they leave. Administration also includes role definition, access request workflows, and the governance processes that ensure identity management aligns with business requirements and regulatory obligations. Our administration processes failed because we had no central visibility into user roles and permissions across our fragmented directory architecture, Elena explained. When that marketing user's account was compromised, we couldn't quickly determine what systems they had access to or what privileges they held because that information was scattered across 16 different identity stores. Authentication establishes and verifies user identity through multiple factors that provide increasing levels of assurance. Modern authentication systems must support not only traditional username and password combinations, but also multi-factor authentication using mobile devices, biometric systems, and hardware tokens. They must implement single sign-on capabilities that enable users to access multiple applications without repeatedly entering credentials, while maintaining security through session management and risk-based authentication that adapts to changing threat conditions. Our authentication controls fail because we relied on password-based authentication for administrative accounts and didn't implement proper multi-factor authentication for high-privilege access, Elena continued. If the compromised marketing account had been required to use multi-factor authentication to access administrative functions in the legacy directory, the attack would have been stopped at the first escalation attempt. Authorization determines what resources and functions users can access based on their verified identity, assigned roles, and current risk assessment. Authorization systems must implement fine-grained access controls that provide users with exactly the permissions they need to perform their job functions while preventing access to resources and capabilities that exceed their business requirements. Modern authorization must also support dynamic decision-making that considers contextual factors such as user location, device security posture, and behavioral patterns. Our authorization controls fail because we implemented excessive permissions to enable interoperability between systems without properly assessing the security implications, Elena said. The service accounts that enabled single sign-on functionality had far more privileges than necessary, creating the escalation pathway that the attackers exploited. Audit provides comprehensive logging, monitoring, and analysis of all identity-related activities to enable rapid detection of suspicious behavior and thorough investigation of security incidents. Audit systems must capture detailed information about authentication attempts, authorization decisions, administrative actions, and user behavior patterns. This information must be analyzed in real time to detect anomalies that may indicate compromise, and stored long-term to support incident investigation and compliance reporting. Our audit capabilities failed because we had no centralized monitoring of identity activities across our distributed architecture, Elena concluded. The attackers operated for 3 days before we detected a compromise because we weren't monitoring for the specific patterns of cross-directory privilege escalation that they used. The room was silent as everyone absorbed the implications of these failures. The identity compromise hadn't resulted from a single technical vulnerability or process failure. It had resulted from systematic architectural weaknesses across all 4 foundational capabilities. Rebuilding the foundation, modern identity architecture. Over the following months, Elena led the most comprehensive identity architecture transformation in the organization's history. Rather than simply patching the immediate vulnerabilities that had enabled the attack, they implemented a completely new approach to enterprise identity management that would serve as the foundation for all future security initiatives. The transformation began with directory consolidation, the systematic migration from 16 fragmented identity stores to a unified identity architecture based on modern cloud-native directory services. This wasn't simply a technology replacement project. It required fundamental changes to business processes, application architectures, and organizational governance structures. We're not just changing technology, Elena explained to the Executive Steering Committee. We're changing how the organization thinks about identity and access control. Every business process that involves user authentication, every application that manages user permissions, every compliance requirement that depends on access controls, all of these must be redesigned to work with our new unified identity architecture. The new architecture implemented what identity professionals call authoritative source design principles. Instead of maintaining user identity information in multiple disconnected systems, all identity data would be maintained in a single authoritative directory that would serve as the source of truth for user identity, role assignments, and access permissions. All other systems would consume identity information from this authoritative source through secure, standardized interfaces. This approach eliminated the complex synchronization relationships that had created attack vectors in the previous architecture. Instead of 47 separate synchronization processes that could fail or be exploited, the new architecture used real-time authentication and authorization requests that were processed by the central identity system. If a user's account was disabled in the authoritative directory, they would immediately lose access to all connected systems without waiting for synchronization processes to propagate the change. The authoritative source approach also enabled comprehensive audit capabilities that had been impossible with the fragmented architecture. Every authentication attempt, authorization decision, and administrative action was logged by the central identity system, providing complete visibility into user behavior across all connected applications and resources. But consolidation alone wasn't sufficient to prevent future attacks. The new architecture also implemented advanced authentication capabilities that would have prevented the specific attack techniques used against the previous system. Multi-factor authentication became mandatory for all administrative accounts and was implemented using adaptive authentication that increased security requirements based on risk assessment. Users accessing administrative functions from familiar locations using managed devices might only need to provide a push notification confirmation on their registered mobile device. The same users accessing administrative functions from unfamiliar locations or unmanaged devices would be required to provide biometric authentication and additional verification. Passwordless authentication was implemented for high-privilege accounts using a combination of biometric identification and hardware security keys. This eliminated the password-based attack vectors that had enabled the initial compromise while providing superior user experience for legitimate administrators. Single sign-on capabilities were redesigned using modern federation standards that eliminated the need for service accounts with excessive privileges. Instead of maintaining shared credentials that could be extracted and abused, the new architecture used token-based authentication that provided temporary, limited-scope access permissions that expired automatically. Privileged access management, the keys to the kingdom. The attack investigation had revealed that the organization's approach to privileged access management was fundamentally flawed. Administrative accounts had been treated as standard user accounts with additional permissions rather than as high-risk assets that required specialized security controls. Service accounts had been created with excessive privileges and permanent passwords that were shared across multiple systems and applications. Elena recognized that privileged access management represented the highest priority component of the identity architecture transformation. These accounts could bypass normal security controls, access sensitive data, and make configuration changes that affected the entire organization's security posture. If regular user accounts were the keys to individual rooms in the digital fortress, privileged accounts were the master keys that could open every door. The new privileged access management architecture implemented what security professionals call zero-standing privileges principles. Instead of maintaining administrative accounts with permanent elevated permissions, the system granted temporary administrative access only when needed for specific tasks and only after additional authentication and approval processes. Administrative users would authenticate using their standard user credentials and multi-factor authentication to access the privileged access management system. From there, they could request specific administrative permissions for defined time periods and business justifications. These requests were evaluated by automated risk assessment systems and, for high-risk activities, required approval from other administrators or business managers. Once approved, users would receive temporary administrative credentials that were automatically generated with precisely the permissions needed for their requested tasks. These credentials expired automatically after predetermined time periods and were monitored continuously for unusual activity patterns. The system also implemented comprehensive session recording for all privileged access activities. Every command executed, file accessed, and configuration change made during privileged sessions was recorded and stored for audit and investigation purposes. This created complete accountability for administrative actions while providing detailed forensic evidence if administrative accounts were compromised. Service accounts presented a different but equally critical challenge. The previous architecture had created service accounts with permanent passwords and broad privileges to enable applications and automated processes to access resources across multiple systems. These accounts were impossible to monitor effectively because they didn't correspond to individual users whose behavior could be baselined and analyzed. The new architecture eliminated shared service accounts wherever possible, replacing them with application-specific identity certificates and token-based authentication that provided limited-scope access permissions. Where service accounts were still necessary, they were managed through automated password rotation systems that changed credentials frequently and monitored their usage patterns for anomalies. Most importantly, the privileged access management system implemented comprehensive analytics that continuously monitored administrative activities for patterns that might indicate compromise. The system baselined normal administrative behavior patterns and generated alerts when activities deviated from established norms. This capability would have detected the weekend administrative activities that characterized the recent attack within minutes rather than days. Federation and modern authentication beyond the perimeter. As Elena's team implemented the core identity infrastructure improvements, they also had to address the reality that modern business operations extended far beyond traditional organizational boundaries. The company worked with thousands of business partners, served millions of customers through digital channels, and used dozens of cloud-based services that required secure identity integration. Traditional approaches to identity management had assumed that users and resources existed within well-defined organizational boundaries protected by network perimeters. Modern business requirements demanded identity architectures that could securely manage authentication and authorization across organizational boundaries while maintaining security and compliance with privacy regulations. Federation technologies enabled the organization to establish trust relationships with business partners, cloud service providers, and customer-facing applications without sharing user credentials or maintaining duplicate identity information. Using standards such as Security Assertion Markup Language, SAML, and OAuth, the organization's identity system could authenticate users and provide limited identity information to external systems without revealing sensitive details about internal directory structures or user privileges. The customer-facing identity architecture presented particularly complex requirements. The organization served customers in multiple countries with different privacy regulations, supported both individual consumers and business customers with different authentication requirements, and needed to provide seamless user experiences across web, mobile, and partner applications. The Customer Identity and Access Management (CIM) system implemented privacy by design principles that minimized data collection, supported customer consent management, and enabled users to control their personal information. Unlike workforce identity systems that prioritize security and administrative control, the customer identity system prioritized user experience and privacy while maintaining adequate security for the organization's business requirements. Business partner identity management required a different approach that balanced security requirements with operational flexibility. Partners needed access to specific business applications and datasets, but their identity management practices and security controls varied significantly. The Federation architecture enabled partners to use their existing identity systems while ensuring that access to the organization's resources was properly authenticated, authorized, and audited. Cloud service integration presented the challenge of maintaining security and compliance while enabling the organization to take advantage of software-as-a-service applications and cloud infrastructure platforms. The identity architecture implemented cloud-native identity providers that could seamlessly integrate with both on-premises systems and cloud services while maintaining centralized identity governance and audit capabilities. User behavior analytics, the intelligence layer. The final component of Elena's identity architecture transformation addressed a fundamental limitation of traditional access control systems. They could verify that users were who they claimed to be and authorize access based on their assigned permissions, but they couldn't effectively detect when legitimate accounts were being used for unauthorized purposes. User behavior analytics (UBA) systems addressed this limitation by implementing machine learning algorithms that established behavioral baselines for individual users and detected anomalies that might indicate account compromise. These systems analyzed patterns such as login times, application usage, data access patterns, and network behavior to create detailed profiles of normal user activity. When users deviated significantly from their established behavioral patterns, the UBA system generated risk scores that could trigger additional authentication requirements, restrict access to sensitive resources, or alert security teams for investigation. This approach enabled the organization to detect insider threats and account compromise scenarios that traditional access controls couldn't identify. The UBA system integration with a broader identity architecture enabled automated responses to behavioral anomalies. Users exhibiting high-risk behavior patterns might be required to re-authenticate using multi-factor authentication, have their access to sensitive resources temporarily restricted, or be required to justify their activities to supervisors or security teams. The system also provided valuable intelligence for continuous improvement of identity security policies. By analyzing patterns of legitimate user behavior, the organization could identify access permissions that were never used and could be safely removed, detect business processes that required access patterns not supported by current role definitions, and identified training opportunities for users who consistently triggered false positive alerts. Most importantly, the UBA system provided the behavioral context that enabled security teams to distinguish between sophisticated attacks and legitimate business activities. The weakened administrative access that had characterized the recent compromise would have been immediately flagged as anomalous behavior requiring investigation, enabling much faster detection and response. The business case for identity excellence. 6 months after the identity compromise incident, Elena presented the results of the identity architecture transformation to the same executive leadership team that had approved the emergency response budget. The quantitative improvements were impressive, but the strategic business benefits were even more significant. Security incident response times for identity-related events had decreased by 85%, from an average of 72 hours to 8 hours. The number of successful account compromise incidents had dropped to 0, compared to an average of 12 per quarter in the previous year. Compliance audit findings related to access controls had been reduced from 47 to 0, eliminating regulatory risk and associated remediation costs. User productivity had improved significantly due to streamlined authentication processes and single sign-on capabilities that eliminated the need to manage multiple passwords and authentication systems. Help desk tickets related to password resets and access issues had decreased by 60%, reducing operational costs while improving employee satisfaction. The strategic benefits were equally compelling. The unified identity architecture provided the foundation for advanced security initiatives including zero-trust networking, cloud migration, and artificial intelligence applications that required secure access to large datasets. The organization could now implement new business capabilities and technology platforms with confidence that identity and access controls will be properly integrated from day one. Perhaps most importantly, the identity architecture transformation had eliminated the complex, fragmented systems that had created the original attack vectors. Future security improvements could be implemented systematically across the unified identity platform, rather than requiring separate implementations across dozens of disconnected systems. The total investment in identity architecture transformation had been $3.2 million over 8 months. The organization's estimated losses from the original identity compromise, including incident response costs, regulatory fines, customer notification expenses, and business disruption, totaled $12.8 million. The return on investment calculation was straightforward, but the long-term value of a properly architected identity foundation was incalculable. Professional development. The identity specialization. Elena's successful leadership of the identity architecture transformation established her as a recognized expert in enterprise identity management, leading to speaking opportunities at industry conferences and consulting engagements with other organizations facing similar challenges. However, the most valuable outcome was the development of identity architecture expertise that would serve her throughout her career regardless of changing technologies or business requirements. Identity and access management represents one of the most challenging and rewarding specializations within cybersecurity. Identity architects must understand not only the technical aspects of authentication systems and directory services, but also the business processes, regulatory requirements, and organizational dynamics that determine how identity systems are used in practice. The field requires continuous learning as new authentication technologies, privacy regulations, and business requirements emerge. Biometric authentication, artificial intelligence applications, Internet of Things devices, and quantum computing will create new identity management challenges that require fresh approaches to established principles. Career advancement in identity management typically involves progression from technical implementation roles to strategic architecture positions with broader organizational impact. Senior identity professionals may become responsible for identity standards development, regulatory compliance management, or executive leadership roles that influence identity practices across multiple organizations. The skills developed through identity management experience transfer effectively to other cybersecurity specializations and technology leadership roles. Understanding how identity systems integrate with network security, endpoint protection, data security, and monitoring capabilities provides the foundation for comprehensive security architecture expertise. For cybersecurity professionals interested in identity specialization, Elena recommended starting with hands-on experience implementing identity controls within existing roles. Contributing to identity projects, participating in access certification campaigns, And volunteering for multi-factor authentication implementations provide opportunities to develop identity expertise while demonstrating value to current employers. Professional certifications including Certified Identity and Security Technologist, CIST, Certified Identity Management Professional, CIMP, and vendor-specific certifications from Microsoft, Okta, and other identity platform providers validate technical expertise and support career advancement. However, practical experience with real organizational identity challenges provides the most valuable learning opportunities. Foundation for advanced security capabilities. As Elena reflected on the lessons learned during her organization's identity transformation, she recognized that the unified identity architecture would serve as the enabling foundation for exploring other security domains in greater depth. Endpoint security, network security, application security, data protection, security monitoring, and incident response all depended on accurate identity verification and authorization capabilities. The architectural approach they had implemented would support advanced security initiatives including zero-trust networking, where every network connection required identity-based authentication and authorization. Cloud security implementations would benefit from centralized identity governance that could seamlessly extend to cloud platforms and services. Security monitoring systems would receive high-quality identity context that would improve threat detection accuracy and reduce false positive alerts. Understanding identity architecture also provided the foundation for implementing emerging security technologies, including artificial intelligence applications that required secure access to large datasets, Internet of Things device management that required automated identity provisioning, and blockchain applications that required identity verification for transaction authorization. The next phase of professional development would involve exploring how identity capabilities integrated with endpoint security systems that protected the devices users employed to access organizational resources. Understanding how identity verification integrated with endpoint protection, device management, and mobile security would provide the comprehensive perspective needed for advanced security architecture roles. Each security domain would require its own technical deep dives and implementation considerations, but the identity foundation Elena's team had built would provide the authentication and authorization capabilities that enabled all other security functions to operate effectively. The journey from fragmented identity systems to unified identity architecture had required significant technical expertise, business understanding, and organizational change management skills. However, the result was a security foundation that would protect the organization's most valuable assets while enabling new business capabilities and technology innovations. Elena's story demonstrated that successful identity architecture required equal measures of technical depth, business alignment, and strategic thinking. The most sophisticated identity technologies provided no value if they couldn't be successfully integrated with existing business processes and organizational requirements. The most comprehensive identity policies failed if they couldn't be implemented within realistic budget and timeline constraints. Understanding identity and access management provided the foundation for advanced specialization in any security domain, while developing the system's thinking skills that enabled career advancement into senior technical and management roles. For cybersecurity professionals seeking to maximize their impact and career potential, developing deep identity expertise represented one of the most strategic investments they could make in their professional development. The foundation was now secure. The next challenge would be protecting the devices that users employed to access the digital fortress, a domain where the battle between security and usability played out on millions of endpoints across the global enterprise network.
If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe to the channel for the latest updates.